the amendment be disagreed to. And on that note, I give the call to the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Labor is excited about the potential of offshore wind. We know how effective it is. We know how good it is at producing zero emissions power. We know largely because Australia is so late to this party. Offshore wind has been around for years. In Europe, 20 years ago, offshore wind farms were a common sight. Seriously, why has it taken so long? Finally, we're here. We've got some legislation. It's not perfect, but it's here and it's welcome. This legislation will finally allow offshore wind to take off here at home. It will establish a regulatory framework for electricity infrastructure in the Commonwealth offshore area. It will allow the construction, installation, commissioning, operation and maintenance of offshore wind and other electricity infrastructure. Australians are very aware of the benefits of renewable energy. They know it's good for the country. They know it's good for their bank accounts. That's why Australia has the world's highest uptake of rooftop solar, the highest in the world. And although this government are currently trying to take a lot of credit for that, it has nothing to do with their policy. Australia has the potential to become a solar and wind superpower, a superpower when it comes to renewable energy. We have such incredible untapped potential, and offshore wind is just one example of this. Australia is in the unique position of being both an island and a continent. We're huge and we have a huge coastline. And our coastline isn't just long, it's abundantly windy. That comes with huge potential for offshore wind power. We know that the conditions of our coasts rival those in the North Sea, where wind farms abound. We have more offshore wind resource than we could ever possibly use ourselves. Recent research by Blue Economy indicates feasible wind resources of 2,233 gigawatts of capacity off Australia's coast. Australia's entire national energy market is around 55 gigawatts. If we utilise even a fraction of that potential, we could export huge amounts of renewable green power to Southeast Asia. Boris Johnson, in many ways a politician very similar to our own Prime Minister, has said in 10 years' time, offshore wind will power every home in the UK. Every home in the UK. That is the potential of this technology. And let's just be abundantly clear. Everyone knows about this potential. It's the coalition, our government, who've been dragging their feet. There's no word for renewable phobia officially, but that's the malady that afflicts those opposite. But it's that malady that is afflicting the jobs opportunities in the towns and the industries and indeed in this country because of their pathological, ideological opposition to renewables being an important part of our sustainable and more certain energy future. Luckily, Australia's energy providers are already there. There are now more than 10 projects that have been proposed and have been waiting for the government to get on with the job of allowing them to go ahead. The Star of the South of Gippsland will power 20% of Victoria's energy needs, 20% from one project. One single rotation of an offshore wind turbine provides as much power as an entire day of rooftop solar, and these turbines turn 15 times a minute. Imagine that, all of Australia's energy problems fixed if we just got on with it. And let's not forget that all of these projects will create lots of jobs. The opportunities that come from offshore wind are abundant. These turbines need maintenance, they need ships to service them, they need people employed at the ports. 26,000 people already work in the offshore wind industry in the UK. It's expected that this number will grow by an extra 70,000 jobs by 2026. To put that in perspective, the total coal industry in Australia currently employs around 52,000 people. And that's before we even begin to talk about solar, hydrogen, hydro, pumped hydro, and all the other renewable industries that will create an additional massive jobs boom. And also, the advantage that will come from affordable energy for intensive industries. And where would these jobs be? Deputy Speaker? Well, they'd be in the regions that power Australia right now. They'd be in the Hunter, in Gippsland, in the Illawarra, in Gladstone, in Latrobe and in central Queensland. The regions that power Australia today will be the regions that power Australia into the future. But you wouldn't know that from the Nationals. You wouldn't know that from the comments of the Minister for Resources. These are their communities, yet they don't want them to benefit from these huge opportunities. Deputy Speaker, it's clear how beneficial offshore wind will be for Australia. We know it, the community knows it, the private sector knows it, and I'm glad that finally the government is belatedly acting on this huge opportunity. The government doesn't have to look far to figure it out. The effectiveness of wind energy can be seen just outside this building, in the capital, in my city of Canberra. It's been 2 years since the ACT officially became the first city outside Europe to be powered by 100% renewable electricity. The ACT has managed this by offsetting its energy use via renewables, including 5 wind farms in resource-rich areas of the country. The Hornsdale Wind Farm in South Australia, the Ararat Wind Farm in Victoria, and just up the Federal Highway in New South Wales, the Crookwell Wind Farm. Canberrans should be proud of this achievement, and the rest of Australia can draw inspiration from it. Deputy Speaker, while we welcome their long overdue epiphany, Labor does have concerns over certain aspects of this bill, specifically around the work health and safety framework and licensing regime. It's concerning that the government has failed to adopt a harmonised national WHS law in the bills, instead amending those laws into a regulatory minefield. Without uniform laws, there is the danger of confusion and real risk for both workers and employers. We don't want to end up with a confusing situation where a worker would be subject to 3 different regulatory regimes, one regime onshore, a second while on vessel in transit, and a third on the job on an offshore project. It's such a mess that even the department, the regulator, and industry stakeholders can't agree on the situation. Further consultation is clearly needed on both the content and coverage of the WHS provisions. Labor has committed to improve and harmonise the WHS regulatory frameworks covering workers in offshore clean energy. We need to get this right. Deputy Speaker, Labor also calls on the government to include an amendment to ensure that benefits from these new industries flow to the communities where they are located. It is a serious concern that the bill doesn't require local benefits to be included in the merit criteria for licences. The Minister of the Day should be required to consider benefits for local workers, businesses, communities and First Nations people when considering whether to grant an offshore electricity licence. While the government's position today is welcome, it can still do so much more. Let's not forget this is the same government that only a few short years ago argued that the sight of a wind farm was offensive and a blight on the landscape. The same government that has said that batteries are as useful as the big banana and that electric vehicles will end the weekend. The Coalition are no climate converts. There's been no road to Damascus experience. The government's hostility to renewable energy the renewable energy revolution sweeping the globe is unchanged. You simply can't believe anything this government says. This government loves the announcement but never follows through with its promises. Just last week, Keith Pitt, the same Keith Pitt who got a promotion in exchange for the government to commit to net zero, in question time tried to undermine solar energy, trotting out the Tony Abbott-era slogan that solar doesn't work at night. The member for Mallee followed this up by claiming wind farms don't work in the dark either. Matt Canavan has floated a mortgage tax to prop up the ailing fossil fuel sector while claiming net zero means compulsory veganism. That's the level of foolishness this debate has sunk to inside the government. If that isn't enough, Mr Canavan and George Christensen are also in open rebellion of the Prime Minister and the government's policy, claiming they'll campaign against their own party on net zero. So now Australia is facing a climate crisis, a leadership crisis, and a government in crisis. Well, Deputy Speaker, we don't just drink water when it rains. We capture it and store it, and then we turn on a tap when we need it. Labor understands this. Labor understands you need to invest in storage and battery technology to store the energy harvested in peak periods. And that's why Labor has already committed to connecting up to 100,000 homes to 400 community batteries across the country. Labor will also invest $20 billion to modernise Australia's energy grid to spur the production of cheap, clean, renewable energy and keep power prices down. Labor understands the government needs the right policy settings so Australia can reap the rewards of the renewable energy boom. But instead of preparing for this change, the Morrison government has chosen inaction and, in the process, scared off international investors. Some 2,700 clean energy jobs are estimated to already have disappeared on Mr Morrison's watch. Jobs ripped away from the regional electorates the Nationals claim to champion. This tired and rudderless government has no ideas. It would rather sow fear and division than harness hope and opportunity. Yesterday, the Prime Minister and the Energy Minister stood up in the Blue Room. They stood up with a nice glossy brochure with their fancy PowerPoint. They stood up and claimed to the Australian people that they had a plan, yet this is no plan. It was a rehash of their old non-policy. In their own words, this is based on existing policy with net zero written on the front. So how serious is the coalition when it comes to net zero? Well, clearly not very, because yesterday they voted against it. Every Liberal, every National, all the so-called modern Liberals. Minister Taylor would have us believe that laws are bad. He'd have us believe that this Parliament enshrining our commitment to climate action is bad. They won't even make a real commitment. Well, a news flash to the Minister is that you are a legislator. That is the role of this Parliament, to make laws, and it's time that this government did their job. The plan released yesterday was not a plan, it was a scam. Australia needs climate action now, and we don't have another 3 years to wait. We need to end the climate wars. We need to move on as a nation. We need to do our part as a global citizen. We need to respect the science. We need to legislate these targets. It is an embarrassment that our Prime Minister is soon be going to Glasgow to represent Australia and doesn't even bring a new target for 2030, which will be the focus of that meeting. We are still under the old Abbott-era targets, and they're not even going to be legislated formal targets. This new plan does not even formally change those 2030 targets. This is so embarrassing, and it is disgraceful that this Prime Minister would try and gaslight the Australian people into believing that this is some sort of action. The government now claims they are committed to net zero by 2050, which is the absolute bare minimum that countries around the world are committing to. But they will not even enshrine this in legislation, and they have voted against it several times now in this Parliament. It's shameful. It is shameful for the people in Australia who understand that we need climate action now, people who respect science, people in my electorate who contact me constantly about this. There is no issue that Canberrans contact me about more often than climate change, and many of these are young people. Our young people are feeling that the adults have let them down, the adults in this Parliament. I remember learning about climate change when I was in primary school. I never would have expected all these years later to be standing here in a Parliament crying out for a government to take action on this existential crisis facing our planet, that a wealthy, developed country like Australia would not feel the need to do our bit on the international stage, and that our government, a coalition government, would treat this with such a lack of seriousness that they think that can get away with an announcement and a glossy brochure. They haven't even released the modelling behind it. The Treasury seems to be distancing itself from this modelling as well, saying that they haven't been much involved today. This is such an important and serious issue. The most authoritative body, the IPCC, have called this code red. They have said this is our last chance to stop our world from reaching a level of warming that is beyond repair. We saw the Black Summer bushfires in 2019-2020, And I know that that looms large in the memory of all Canberrans and all Australians. These things will become more common. That unprecedented catastrophe, those events will become more common in Australia and around the world